Shalom, shalom, my chaverim. Greetings, my fellow believers.
What's up, my people?
And welcome back, friends, to Bible on a Bicycle.
This program is made possible by financial support from viewers like you.
My name is Will, and I'm an aspirant follower of Yeshua Hamashiach. You might know him as Jesus Christ. And in this series of little videos, we've been taking a look at those other Christmas stories contained within the pages of our Bibles. If you haven't been along for the ride, you might want to check out these videos, get all caught up. But in the meantime, we're going to delve right into part 3 of those other more mysterious Christmas stories. So what are these other Christmas stories? And what do they mean to us as believers? Well, we haven't been relying upon this old guy for our exploration into this subject, but rather we've been relying on one of my favorite teachers and preachers, Dr. Tim Mackie, as he tells some of those other Bible stories.
Reading from Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 to 25. Now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. But as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save the people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took his wife, but knew her not until she had given birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus.
All right, it's our last week of Christmas baby Jesus stories. We're working through what Matthew called the Genesis of Jesus. Remember the first words of the book, the Genesis of Jesus, the Messiah, son of Abraham, son of David. It's the stories of Jesus' family history and then the circumstances of his birth. And so we have to ask these questions as readers. Why are these stories here? And they're here, at least as we've kind of been exploring, because they're meant to tell us something not just about who Jesus was, but they tell us truths about who Jesus is and who he is for us as his people today. And they illuminate the character and the reality of Jesus. And so these stories today, these are the stories that typically don't make it into the Christmas play. Right? So the flight to Egypt and these children being massacred and then like having to move back to their second choice town, of Nazareth. You're like, have you ever seen those like retold at the Christmas pageant play? Like, no, it'd be kind of hard to depict. And it would kind of kill the mood of the whole thing too, wouldn't it? So these are, but they're crucially part of the Genesis of Jesus. And these are stories, again, because we're familiar with them through the Christmas cards or whatever that come around during the holidays, we tend to read these stories through rose-colored glasses, so to speak. And they're just, well, it's Jesus. And of course, they run around and there's horrible, crazy things happening. He's the Messiah's birth or whatever, and we just kind of move on with the story. But Matthew has done something very profound in describing this part of the life of the infant Jesus and of his parents. And I want us to, as always, to kind of try and disassociate anything you think you already know about these stories and just put yourselves in the shoes of these characters, of this young mother, of this young father who's adopted this spontaneously generated son, right, into his family, and then like everything that happens to them. I mean, really try and think about what you would be thinking and feeling if these were your circumstances. You're a pregnant Jewish teenager, and you, like, that's just crazy in and of itself, like how that all went down. And then you thought your fiance was going to break the engagement, but then he has a dream, and then he doesn't. Like, that's a crazy week in and of itself. You know what I'm saying? Just that alone. But then, then far away, some Roman politician, right? The whole empire that's militarized your whole ancient homeland over the last 50 years decides they're going to raise taxes, and it forces everybody to go to their ancestral roots and take part of the census and so on. And so you're pregnant, quite pregnant, and you have to make this 80-mile trip on a donkey or horseback or whatever. And so that's really inconvenient and uncomfortable. And so then you have to do that. And then while you're there, somehow, we don't know, you get stuck there, away from your mom, away from your aunts, away from your midwife or whatever, from your hometown, and you give birth in a town that is not your town. And you end up doing so under really like awkward, difficult circumstances, right? In whatever this kind of cave or whatever is represented by the manger. We don't actually know if it was like a stable, a cave, or spare room of a house. We don't actually know. But the whole point is that it was not ideal circumstances under which you give birth away from your family. And then it gets even worse. Because, of course, there's this whole thing about these really strange magicians showing up from the far ancient East, and they drop a load of cash in your lap. That's actually pretty cool, right? if that were to happen to you. But, it's kind of bizarre, and then there's these, like, shepherds who keep, like, filing in to want to see your baby, and that's weird, and they keep wanting to hold him, and you're like, please wash your hands, or whatever, I don't know, whatever. So, right, they're shepherds, So that's all kind of like, there's this moment of the birth, and that's significant, though we're not told anything about Jesus having a halo or him not crying. I imagine he cried and pooped like any young, human did. So there's that, but then, you're like, Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, and so on. And then it just tanks. Like the things just go from okay and awkward and inconvenient to horrible. Horrible. So you're a young mom, and you hear that there's Roman soldiers marching the 5 miles from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, and they're coming for your baby. And you have to flee in the middle of the night and start this 300-mile trek down south through the deserts of Israel and then of Egypt to get to most likely Alexandria, Egypt, where there's a big community of Jewish people living there. And so on the way, of course, you hear this report that those Roman soldiers went through the whole village of Bethlehem, and they rounded up all of the boys that have been born in the last 2 years, and they slaughtered them. And they're looking for your baby. And that haunts you as you go down to Egypt, and you're just stuck there. You don't know anybody, you have the Jewish community there, but your family's not there, and you're raising your toddler in this place that's foreign to you. And there you go, you're stuck there for the first years of your baby's life. And then you hear this report that, like, the big bad Herod who was trying to do all of this, he dies. And so you're like, oh, finally, the storm's blown over. So you go back and you're going to settle in your husband's hometown. If our son really is the Messiah, we should go to the roots and to this town of David where David was born. And then you show up there, and then you realize, holy cow, like Herod's son, who's about as bad as Herod was, is the guy ruling on the throne now. And so, like, at the last minute, you're like, I guess, where do we go? We have to go back to Mary's hometown. And so you make the 80-mile trek back up, and then you go back to your small, little, no-name, podunk hill country town where the rumor mill is just churning and will continue to churn for decades about your mysterious pregnancy. And that's about a 3-year period of Mary's life. Now, let's say that was your life. How are you feeling about your life right now? Right? I mean, really think about that. I dare say that this 3 years of this family's life is probably one of the most traumatic stories you could ever hear anyone tell. I mean, really think about that. And why did Matthew include these stories? It's like Jesus is here, it's all amazing, and then it just crashes and burns, and it's these stories of terror and tragedy. What is going on here? And if you and I were in Mary's circumstances, I think that we would find ourselves in a place that many of us do find ourselves in, when hardship or tragedy or things unknown or fear hits our lives in some way, we start asking questions, right? We start asking, where is God? Why is all of this happening to me? And so on. I mean, can you imagine Mary's prayers while she's fleeing to Egypt and hears the report about the massacre in Bethlehem, looking for her son? I mean, what prayers did she pray that night? And did she perceive those prayers as ever being answered? Where is God in moments like that? In my mind, that's what these stories raise. Is where is God in the moments of the most horrendous evil or tragedies or fears that hit our lives, the storms that hit our lives? It seems to me these stories in Matthew 2 are trying to challenge how we think about God and suffering and when these storms hit our lives. And they challenge what I call is, I think, a very common myth about Christianity in our culture, which is, I call it the myth of religious fulfillment. It's the idea that I invite Jesus into my life, and so he died for me and my sins and my failures. I'm reconciled to God, and so now I have all of these hopes and dreams and aspirations for my life. And Jesus is gracious, he's good, and so of course he's going to help me make all of those dreams come true. And then it doesn't happen. Or then the opposite happens. Then your nightmares happen. And where is God? When it looks like the train has gone off the tracks and terrors and tragedies strike your life. And this story moves at that whole set of issues and questions in three movements. I don't know if you've noticed them, but there's 3 movements to this story. And each one kind of tells about something that happened that's horrible or terrifying or tragic. And then it concludes by linking it up to some kind of fulfillment to the Old Testament scriptures. Did you notice that as it read through it? There are 3 different times. And so each one of these movements in the story is trying to explore or get at who is God and where is God in these moments of terror and tragedy. And so let's consider them as we go through the story. How you guys doing? Let's start from the top. So as Peter was reading, I was just thinking, verse 13, when they had gone, if you weren't here last week, you're like, huh? They? Who's they? Right? So they is these astrologers, right? These magicians from the far ancient East. And they had been working their astrological star charts, whatever, and they discerned that some really important, significant king was being born to the west, thousands of miles, and so they started this 2 years, just the craziest story in the world, they start this journey, right? And so they go to Jerusalem, big caravan. We're nowhere told that there were just 3 of them. Did you know this? I don't remember if Josh mentioned this last week. There were 3 gifts offered. But we're told that the caravan was so huge that the whole city of Jerusalem was startled as this thing showed up into town. So it was probably a huge, huge caravan of people and quite a number of these astrologers. And so they come and they ask the king of Jerusalem this question. Never ask a king this question. Where is the new king that was just born? So just don't ever, if you meet President Obama, you'd be like, where's the real president? It's just no, don't do that. Really bad idea. Especially don't ask that question to a king like Herod, right? Who's deeply insecure and has a real violent streak. So bad question. They didn't know what they were doing, but it sets off this whole chain of events. And so they just left, right? They dropped this huge load of cash, essentially, in Mary and Joseph's lap, which they almost certainly are going to need over the next 3 years to do this whole journey that's ahead of them. And then all of a sudden they say, listen, you're not safe. Right? An angel appears to Joseph. You got to get out of here. Now you're a young mom. You have a baby. And then all of a sudden, you're not safe. Your baby has a price on his head. You got to get out of here right now. It's just horrifying, absolutely terrifying if this was you. And so they flee during the night, and they get up and they go. And so here's terror and tragedy number one, right? Surely, where is God? Why is this happening? Why can't we catch a break? It's just one crazy thing after another. Surely the train has gone off the tracks. And Matthew says, actually, no. What's happening here fits into a larger pattern. Have you ever heard of a story where God raised up a deliverer, but then there's some insecure, power-hungry king who uses oppression and violence to try and thwart God's purposes? I wonder if I can think of a story like that before. And Matthew's like, yeah. And what does he say? He says this, look at verse 15. He says, so was fulfilled what the Lord said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Now, what prophet is he quoting? You got a footnote to look at there? Hosea, the prophet Hosea, chapter 11. Now, here's what I think happens in most of our minds. We think, wow, this is really remarkable. So Hosea, predates Jesus about 800 years. And Hosea, had a dream, and he watched the little movie in his dream about Joseph and Mary and going down to Egypt and coming out, and then he predicted that it would happen. And we're like, whoa, that's so crazy, Nostradamus, but for real. So, right? I think that's how many people perceive what Matthew's doing here. And then, the five of you who care about these kinds of things, you go like, oh, Hosea, oh, that's in my Bible, so I'll just go up and go read the book of Hosea, and see like Matthew, like, wow, that's really cool. So you go look it up, and what you read is this, Hosea chapter 11, this is the context here. When Israel was a child, this is Yahweh speaking through the prophet, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. But the more they were called, the more they went away from me. They sacrificed to the Baals, and they burned incense to images. It was I, Yahweh says, who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the arms, but they did not realize it was I who healed them. Now, just stop right there. So where did the little movie screen of Joseph and Mary going down to Egypt, did you see it play out anywhere right here? Now, not only did you not see a little Nostradamus-style prediction thing playing out right here, what you see actually here is a recollection of the past. This is the prophet Hosea poetically reflecting on the past story of the roots of the Israelite people. So Israel was a child. I loved, out of Egypt I called my son. What story is Hosea recollecting here? He's reflecting the Exodus story. So, and actually in the Exodus story, in Exodus chapter 4, Yahweh calls Israel my firstborn son. He says to Pharaoh, let my son go. Let my people go, or let my son go. It's interchanged in the Exodus story. And so Hosea picks up this metaphor that Israel is like Yahweh's child, Yahweh's son. And so he brought the people out of slavery from Egypt into the promised land and gave them this really good land. And what does Israel do? They go and worship other gods and so on. And Yahweh's like, what? I taught you to walk. I made you into a nation, and you do this to me, And they never looked to me. They didn't realize. It's a very powerful poem, Hosea chapter 11. So what on earth is Matthew doing? What's he doing right here? Welcome to the wonderful, strange world of how Jesus and the apostles read and quote from the Jewish scriptures. And if your only idea in your head is Nostradamus-style prediction, then this is just going to be madly frustrating to you. Because that's actually not what the New Testament authors are doing most of the time. They quote from the Old Testament scriptures. Jesus and Matthew, the apostles, they read the Jewish scriptures as telling one coherent storyline that's moving forward. It's all pointing forward. There's all these unresolved tensions and so on with Israel and the covenants and sacrifices and so on. It's all these dangling threads that are just left there as the story of the Old Testament comes to a close. And they see Jesus and Matthew, all the apostles, they see the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus, the gift of the Spirit, as bringing all of these loose threads together right here. And so, he will use a passage like Hosea chapter 11, but he wants you to think, anytime, this is going to be frustrating or exciting to some of you, right? Anytime you ever see an Old Testament passage quoted in the New Testament, they're never just using or alluding to the words that they've quoted. They just assume you know the whole Bible inside out, and they just assume you know the 24 other passages that are all connected to the one that they just quoted. And you're just supposed to know all of that to make sense of it. And so, sorry, I don't know what to tell you, but I'll try and help recreate the trail for you, at least right here. So what's he doing right here? Matthew wants us to see something. Is he wants us to see that, is this the first time that some selfish, powerful human has tried to thwart God's purposes to save and redeem his world and his people? No. And so he wants us to see that in these events of the life of Jesus, that the train has not come off the tracks, but actually we're replaying a whole pattern that's already taken place once in history. And so Jesus, as Israel's Messiah, as the capital S Son of God, is replaying in his life the same story that Israel went through. So here's a cool chart, and some of you are bored right now, but I don't care, because this is cool. So think through, why has Matthew chosen these specific stories here? And part of it is because he's weaving a pattern into the early chapters of Matthew that recollect the story of the Exodus. So for example, it begins with this journey to Egypt. And then you have this oppressive king killing children. Now, where in the Bible do you have an oppressive king killing children? Well, that's how the Exodus story begins, doesn't it? Right? With the Pharaoh is threatened by the people of Israel, and so he orders the male Israelites, after they're born, the children to be thrown into the Nile River. And so Herod has become the new Pharaoh. If Jesus represents the new Israel and the Son of God fulfilling all of the purposes that God has been working towards all along, then Herod becomes this new Pharaoh. And so you have God's Son called out of Egypt, and then Matthew's clever. This is great. So in the story of the Exodus, of course, after they're called out of Egypt, they go to Mount Sinai, and they're 40 years in the wilderness. And then they go through the Jordan River into the Promised Land. And the way Matthew tells the story is Jesus comes up out of Egypt, and as we're going to see here, he settles in the town of Nazareth. And then what's the very next story? It's Jesus passing through the Jordan, so to speak. And it's as if he's the people of Israel. He's doing and retelling in his own life the story and the fulfillment of the whole story of the people of Israel. And then where does Jesus go right after that? He goes into the wilderness. For how long? For 40 days. Now, not 40 years. He would have been like 70 or something like that afterwards. But the whole point is, do you see what Matthew's doing here? Right? He's trying to get you to see that even amidst the most horrific circumstances, is God surprised or caught off guard by the evil of Herod? Answer, no. Did God ordain the evil of Herod? Answer, say no. Say it very quickly. Say it strongly and very quickly. No, definitely not, right? Definitely not. But is God surprised? This is how humans always respond. When he tries to work his redemptive purposes, it generates resistance. Because when God gets involved, it threatens the status quo of how we think the world ought to be run when he introduces his upside-down kingdom. And so Matthew's, it's very theological and quoting the scriptures and so on, but it's a very practical point. In the midst of this terror that Mary must be experiencing, Matthew reminds us that the train has not gone off the tracks. Yes, this is a terrifying, tragic experience. But despite that evil, God is still working his redemptive purposes.
The only hope we have is the hope in Yeshua Hamashiach. Well said, Tim. Well said, as always. Now, I don't always agree 100% with what Tim has to say theologically, but I seldom disagree with what he teaches. I really appreciate how Tim points out those connections between the Old Testament and Yeshua that are so often overlooked. Anyway, that's what I got to say about it, but I'd be interested in knowing what you had to say about these other Christmas stories that seldom get told in Sunday school. Are you familiar with them? And were you aware of the connections to the Old Testament contained in those stories? Let me know what you think in those comments down below. And if you're not already subscribed, why not hit that little subscribe button down there? Give us a little love right next door with that thumbs up, and hit that share button to give the gift of this video to any friends or family members that you think might benefit from or enjoy watching this here little video. Big shout out to all my subscribers, both returning and new. This channel really wouldn't be much without you now, would it? I surely do appreciate you spending your time here with me. And until next time, remember, Yeshua, Jesus loves you. So do I. Now get off of here, gather up your family, go ride your bikes, and read your Bible.